Good morning. I'm Ellen Horseman with Camden, Arkansas's First United Methodist Church. I welcome you to Sunday School class. We're doing a series right now, a book by a Matt Rawle, a Bossier City, Louisiana United Methodist pastor. His book is entitled The Heart That Grew Three Sizes, Finding Faith in the Story of the Grinch. And if you're looking online, I was trying to get that lined up. There we go. The Heart That Grew Three Sizes, Finding Faith in the Story of the Grinch. And it is actually based on this story by Dr. Seuss, How the Grinch Stole Christmas. Not so much on the movies and other adaptations, but the book itself. It's a lot of fun to go through, and I can tell you that I cannot do justice to this wonderful book because there's just not enough time. So if you're not reading it, you might really enjoy it. Let me begin, before we turn to Matt Rawle, by looking at a passage from Isaiah chapter 11 that's often read in the Christmas season. A shoot will grow up from the stump of Jesse. A branch will sprout from its roots. The Lord's Spirit will rest upon him, a spirit of wisdom and understanding, a spirit of planning and strength, a spirit of knowledge and fear of the Lord. He will delight in fearing the Lord. He won't judge by appearance nor decide by hearsay. He will judge the needy with righteousness and decide with equity for those who suffer in the land. He will strike the violent with the rod of his mouth. By the breath of his lips he will kill the wicked. Righteousness will be the belt around his hips and faithfulness the belt around his waist. The wolf will live with the lamb, and the leopard will lie down with the young goat. The calf and the young lion will feed together, and a little child will lead them. The cow and the bear will graze. Their young will lie down together, and a lion will eat straw like an ox. A nursing child will play over the snake's hole. Toddlers will reach right over the serpent's den. They won't harm or destroy anywhere on my holy mountain. The earth will surely be filled with the knowledge of the Lord, just as the water covers the sea. This beautiful vision of Isaiah's looks forward to a time when there is true peace and true hope in this world. And that's part of what Matt Rawle covers in his chapter 2, talking about when Christmas isn't Christmas, because that's the name of his chapter, When Christmas Isn't Christmas. And that title is a reminder that we can't or shouldn't confuse that which is not the thing for the real thing. Of course, it's not unusual at this time of year to hear people talking about Jesus is the reason for the season, trying to remind us where our thoughts should be. But still, we get wrapped up in the many, many things that we feel like mean Christmas, that make Christmas real to us. And sometimes we get confused about what Christmas really is, just as sometimes we get confused about what Christianity is or should be. Now, the book The Grinch not the book The Grinch, let me say that again. The character, the Grinch, attempts to parody Christmas. And he does this by taking the things that he believes are Christmas and turning them on their head. So what are these things? Well, he takes a Santa suit, and instead of it being the suit that is worn by a gift giver, it's worn by the Grinch, who is taking the presents away. He doesn't have a real reindeer. He appropriates a dog for that role. And I lost my chain. Wait a minute. and he has a toy bag, but instead of the toy bag being something that brings gifts, he uses it to take gifts away. So he takes the things that he believes that the Whos are associating with Christmas. He takes the things that Grinch thinks equal Christmas, and he turns them on their head. And the reason that he's able to misuse these things, as Rawle says, is because they aren't really the heart of Christmas. He goes on to say that gifts under the tree, or stockings hung by the fireplace, and a home adorned with ornaments and lights all have the potential to point us to the story of Christ's birth. But these cultural markers are not the miracle itself. We mustn't confuse the thing that points here for the thing itself. We mustn't confuse that which is not the thing for the thing itself. The Christ child was coming to bring peace. In many churches, we will light an Advent candle of peace. But peace itself is also something that can be parodied, said Rawle. And he gives us a wonderful example, Herod. Herod tells the wise men, "Now when you have found this new king, come and tell me where he is, so that I may go and worship him." What Herod says sounds right. It sounds like the right thing to say. But the problem is, that's not his real motivation. He has no intention of going and worshiping this king. He's setting out to destroy the king. Now, Herod's reign itself, as well as the reign of Rome under whom he served, might be mistaken for peace. Because we have a tendency to define peace as the absence of conflict or the absence of war. Well, Herod and Rome could enforce an absence of conflict, but they did this through the use of violence. Is that real peace? In this parody of peace, there's oppression, there's selfishness, there's suffering, and there is definitely turning a blind eye away from poverty and suffering. So don't mistake that which is not the real thing for the real thing. The true peace was coming into the world. The peace of God was in the Christ child. That's God breaking into creation to do as Jesus will read from Luke. Read as it's recorded in Luke. He reads from Isaiah. This is God breaking in creation to preach good news to the poor, release to the prisoners, recovery of sight to the blind, and to liberate the oppressed. This is the Messiah that, as Isaiah said in that little excerpt I read you, who will judge the needy with righteousness and decide with equity for those who suffer in the land. This is the true peace of Christmas and of all time. Not an enforced absence of conflict as a means of control, but a love that brings reconciliation between God and humanity, and that brings reconciliation and love between neighbor and neighbor. Friends, do we focus on the outward appearance of Christmas instead of truly anticipating the presence of God with us? Maybe the Grinch didn't have it all wrong. Maybe the Who's have concentrated too much on their presents and their decorations and their feastings. I should have thought of this ahead of time. I'm going to see if I can find one of the pages that shows us the Who's as they are celebrating on Christmas morning after they get all their presents. Oh, where is it? Yes, and if you can see this, of course, if you're listening on the podcast, you can't. But so let me describe the picture that I have and see if I can line it up here. You see just a ton of kids in this picture, and they're all running around with toys. One of them is springing out, and one's shooting arrows, and one's on a train, and one has a great big ball, and it's just a busy, busy scene. And what is it and it says, "Merry, Merry, Merry" at the top of it. And what seems to them to be Christmas there is all these toys, all these gifts, as well as the feast that comes on the very next page. So maybe the Grinch wasn't wrong at all. Maybe the Who's really have concentrated too much on their presents and their decorations and their feasting. Grinch is not upset. If you read this book, he's not upset with the Who's for expressing their faith. He's not upset with the Who's because they're reaching out in concern or loving service. He's upset with their decorations. He's upset with their noisy toys. He's upset with their never-ending feasting. Now, I guess the one thing he's upset with that maybe was a good thing the Who's was doing was their singing, although we don't know what they were singing. Now, Rawle says that we sometimes do this ourselves, like the Who's. We get too wrapped up in our decorations and our gifts and all these things. And he said certainly the celebrations that we had to have for Christmas last year in 2020 in this pandemic really were quite different because of the pandemic. And maybe sometimes it felt like Grinch was trying to steal away Christmas. He said at the church where he pastors, they really struggled about how they could have a safe service. And they finally, they always had a great big ornate service, but instead they ended up outdoors. They made some fire pits and ended up outdoors. And he said he just grabbed his guitar and went out and strummed along as they sang a few songs. He had a very simple sermon, and he said they didn't even pass an offering plate, which would have been unheard of at a Christmas Eve service. But he said even though the service was so very different from what they were accustomed to, with the simple music and the simple singing, the simple message, he said it was absolutely beautiful. And he said that even without the usual practices, Christmas Eve had never felt so authentic. So he says the pandemic and the Grinch, they might be teaching us something. Here's what Rawle says. What if God is even working through one whose heart is 2 sizes too small? What if it's been our heart all along that needed to grow through the simplicity and beauty of gathering around a fire under the midnight sky to give thanks and praise for the one who emptied himself so that we might know the radical love of God? Yes. The Grinch thought that he could stop Christmas. If you read the book, he thought he could stop Christmas by taking all the presents and the decorations and the food. And so after he has these all gathered up, he's up at the top of the mountain about to drop all the presents down off of it. He realizes, oh, it ought to be about the time that all the Who's are waking up. And he's just sure that when they do, he's going to hear this great big cry of boo-hoo, boo-hoo. And so he stops what he's doing so he can listen. And he is startled because the sound he hears is not this loud boo-hoo when they wake up and find out that their presents and their decorations and all of their food is gone. He's not hearing that loud boo-hoo. Instead, he hears them singing beautifully. And the Grinch is stunned because he thought he was taking away Christmas. And he realizes that maybe Christmas wasn't the present and the decorations at all. Maybe Christmas was really something else. Of course, this highlights the fact that Christmas sometimes is not how we anticipate it to be. I mean, what makes something Christmas, or if I can use the word, Christmassy? Now, Matt Rawle mentioned that there's a controversy over whether the movie Die Hard is a Christmas movie. Well, I don't think I've ever seen Die Hard. I know it's an action film. So I was surprised that it was considered a Christmas movie, but apparently it has a lot of Christmas music and it takes place at Christmas time. And so that's why they think of it as a Christmas movie. But I actually Googled it online, is Die Hard a Christmas movie, and found out there is a lot of discussion about whether it's a Christmas movie. And the funny thing is, you can find movie reviewers, professional reviewers, and you can find professors, and they're discussing whether Die Hard is a Christmas movie or not. And you can find some that say, oh, it absolutely is, and some that say it absolutely isn't. And that's because it's not about what we would consider Christmassy things. And so it highlights the fact that the Christmas message doesn't always accompany Christmas music and decorations. But also, Rawle says, sometimes things that appear not to have anything to do with Christmas at all, but the Christmas story, we find that the Christmas story is truly at their heart. So sometimes things don't appear to have anything to do with Christmas, but instead we find the Christmas story is definitely at the heart of those things. And he mentioned that in the city where he lives, at that time when our country had families, we were splitting families apart at the border, and we were ending up with children in prisons and so forth. He said a church near him staged a Christmas pageant, and they built cages and had the members of the Holy Family in separate cages to sort of show what was going on. And he said that image was really jarring. I imagine a lot of people probably objected to it. It didn't feel very Christmassy. And yet, why did the Christ child come? The Christ child, even at his birth, begins uniting all people. The Magi come from the east. Now, we don't think about this a lot, but as Rawle says they come from Babylon, or at least from the vicinity of Babylon. And so he said, when they come from the east, when they come from Babylon, this symbolizes the redemption of Babylon. Remember that Babylon was the empire that had taken the Judeans off into captivity. And so in Old Testament literature, it was depicted as the horrible place, the evil place. And so when we have these magi coming, he said that that symbolizes the redemption of Babylon, the hated empire. And later in the story around the narrative of Jesus, remember that the Holy Family, to escape from Herod as he's trying to harm the children, they escape into Egypt of all places. Egypt becomes a place of refuge. Remember that Egypt was where the Israelites had been held as slaves. And again, Egypt is depicted as the place of slavery, this evil place. And so it's becoming a refuge for the Holy Family, symbolizes the redemption of Egypt. And it reminds us too, because there's Mary and Joseph being foreigners in Egypt. And it reminds us of how often in the Hebrew Scriptures, over and over and over, God stresses the importance of welcoming the immigrant among you, of being just and kind and good to the foreigner living among you. So we shouldn't be surprised that a God who repeatedly calls his people to have compassion on foreigners and immigrants should make them part of the Christmas story. I mean, what could be more Christmassy than that? And what can be more Christmassy than hope? Hope. That's another one of the themes we have of Advent. We lit a candle of hope last week. Rawle says the season of Advent is like poetry. It's like poetry in the sense that we hope for something that has already happened. And you can't fit that into a math equation or a blueprint. It's more like poetry. Advent hope, he says, is an exercise in poetry. Because against what the data is reporting, against what your eyes see and your ears hear, hope offers a different narrative. Now, our reading from Isaiah chapter 11 that I began with is an example of that hope. Rawle reminds us that this was written in spite of all the many things that the prophet had seen go on. Like the other people of Judah, the prophet had seen Assyria completely destroy Israel. And now Judah is threatened. And even though Jerusalem's destruction seems inevitable, Isaiah says, a shoot will grow up from the stump of Jesse. A branch will sprout from its root. This new shoot will have the Spirit of the Lord resting on him. I got to stop for a minute and stop myself for a minute. Listen to what he's saying. Jerusalem is about to be destroyed. Judah is about to be destroyed. They're about to be carried off into captivity. And yet, in the midst of that, Isaiah expresses hope that a shoot will grow up from the stump of Jesse. Things might be destroyed, but not completely, because a shoot is going to branch out. It's going to grow up from that. A branch will sprout from its root. And then it's going to be something glorious, because this new shoot will have the Spirit of the Lord resting upon him. This new shoot, he will know wisdom and understanding, and he will judge wisely and fairly. He won't just offer the Word of God, but he will be the poetry of God, because the ordered lines between humanity and the divine will be blurred in his own person. Now, that last comment was from Rawle. I want to give him credit because he stated it so well, that this offspring, this shoot that grows out of the stump of Jesse, this Christ child, will be the poetry of God, because the ordered lines between humanity and the divine will be blurred in his own person. To have this divine hope, we need to have peace with our neighbors. You know, we can't have true peace as long as there are people who are hungry, as long as there are people who have no home to shelter them, as long as there are foreigners who are being mistreated, or if anybody is being mistreated. We cannot have true peace when we exclude other people, when we get into our little cliques or our little clubs or groups. We cannot have true peace when there are people on the outside, and we only want to cling to those who are on the inside. You know, the Grinch was an outsider. We don't think about that very much. He's not necessarily the sympathetic character, seemingly, in this book, but he was an outsider. And why is that? We aren't told, of course. Could it be that the Who's just paid no attention to him? Could it be that the Who's maybe weren't deliberately cruel, but they were cruel in the sense that they didn't seek out the outsider or even know or care that he existed? Could it be, or should it be, that the Who's really need to include the Grinch in order to really be at peace? When we live in peace, it's easier to have hope, especially when everything in the world seems to be turned upside down, as it seems to be in what I am beginning to think is the never-ending pandemic. Matt Rawle suggests that the real poetry of Advent will come not just when we've brought all the beautiful greenery from the outside into our church, but when we have brought the inside out, to where the church itself no longer has walls, because we have finally realized, after building and destroying our little God boxes over and over again, that God doesn't fit in a box. And after all, our ultimate hope is that heaven and earth will be one. God will be with God's people. Emmanuel, God with us. My friends, may you have a good and blessed week full of the hope and the peace that only God can bring. Bye-bye.